Hi guys, welcome back to my reading on the channel. Gonna read the next couple of chapters and hope we can get through them. We'll see how it goes. This is Roald Dahl, Danny the Champion of the World, and it's all Roald Dahl's own work. I'm just reading it for entertainment. So without further ado, let's get going. Chapter 19, Rockabye Baby. At 8:30 the next morning, my father went into the workshop and dialed Doc Spencer's number on the telephone. "Now listen, Doctor," he said, "if you could be here at the filling station in about half an hour, I think I might have a little surprise present for you." The doctor said something in reply, and my father replaced the receiver. At 9 o'clock, Doc Spencer arrived in his car. My father went over to him, and the two of them held a whispered conversation beside the pumps. Suddenly, the tiny doctor clapped his hands together and sprang up high into the air, hooting with laughter. "You don't mean it," he cried. "It's not possible." He then rushed over to me and grasped my hand in his. "I do congratulate you, my dear boy," he cried, pumping my hand up and down so fiercely it nearly came off. "What a triumph! What a miracle! What a victory!" Now, why on earth didn't I think of that method myself? You are a genius, sir. Hail to thee. Dear Danny, you're the champion of the world. Here she comes, my father called out, pointing down the road. "Here she comes, Doctor." "Here who comes?" the doctor said. "Mrs. Clipstone." He spoke the name proudly as though he were a commander referring to his bravest officer. The three of us stood together beside the pumps looking down the road. "Can you see her?" my father asked. Far away in the distance I could just make out a small figure advancing towards us. "What's she pushing, Dad?" My father gave a sly look. "There's only one way of delivering pheasants safely," he said, "and that's under a baby. Isn't that right, Doctor?" "Under a baby?" the Doc Spencer said. "Of course, in a pram with a baby on top." "Fantastic," the doctor said. "My old dad thought that one up many years ago," my father said, "and it's never been known to fail yet." "It's brilliant," Doc Spencer said. "Only a brilliant mind can think of a thing like that." "He was a brilliant man," my father said. "Can you see her now, Doctor? And that'll be young Christopher Clipstone sitting up in the pram. He's 1.5, a lovely child. I birthed him," Doc Spencer said. "He weighed 8 pounds 3 ounces." I could just make out the small dot of a baby sitting high up in the pram, which had its hood folded down. "There's more than 100 pheasants under that little nipper," my father said happily. "Just imagine it. You can't put 100 pheasants in a child's perambulator," Doc Spencer said. "Don't be ridiculous." "You can if it's been specifically made for the job," my father said. "This one is built extra long and extra wide, and it's got extra deep well underneath. Listen, you could push a cow around in there if you wanted to, let alone 100 pheasants and a baby." "Did you make it yourself, Dad?" I asked. "More or less, Danny. You remember when I walked you to school and then went off to buy the raisins?" "The day before yesterday," I said. "Yes, and after that I went straight on to the vicarage, converted their pram into the special extra-large poacher's model. It's a beauty. It's a beauty, really it is. You wait till you see it, and Mrs. Clipstone says it pushes even easier than her ordinary one. She did a practice circuit with it in a backyard as soon as I finished it." "Fantastic," the doctor said again. "Absolutely fantastic." "Normally," my father went on, "an ordinary bought pram is all you'd never need. But then there's no one ever has 100 pheasants to deliver before now." "Where does the baby sit?" the doctor asked. "On top, of course," my father said. "All you need is a sheet to cover them, and baby sits on the sheet. A bunch of pheasants make a nice soft mattress for any child." "I don't doubt it," the doctor said. "He'll be having a very comfortable ride today, young Christopher," my father said. We stood beside the pumps, waiting for Mrs. Clipstone to arrive. It was the 1st of October, and one of those warm, windless autumn mornings, with a darkening sky and a smell of thunder in the air. What was so marvellous about my father, I thought, was the way he always surprised you. It was impossible to be with him for long without being surprised and astounded by one thing or another. He was like a conjurer, bringing things out of a hat. Right now it was the pram and the baby. In a few minutes it would be something else again. I felt sure of that. "Right through the village, bold as brass," my father said. "Good for her." "She seems in an awful hurry, Dad," I said. "She's sort of half running." "Don't you think she's sort of half running, Dr. Spencer?" "I imagine she's just a bit anxious to unload her cargo," the doctor said. My father squinted down the road. An approaching figure She does appear to be going quite a bit, doesn't she? He said carefully. She's going very quick, I said. There was a pause. My father was beginning to stare hard at the lady in the distance. Perhaps she doesn't want to be caught in the rain, he said. I'll bet that's exactly what it is. She thinks it's going to rain and she doesn't want the baby to get wet. She could put the hood up, I said. He didn't answer this. She's running, Doc Spencer cried. Look! It was true. Mrs. Clipstone had suddenly broken into a full sprint. My father stood very still, staring at her, and in the silence that followed I fancied I could hear a baby screaming. What's up, Dad? He didn't reply. There's something wrong with that baby, Doc Spencer said. Listen. At this point, Mrs. Clipstone was about 200 yards away from us, but closing fast. Can you hear him now, Dad? Yes, I can hear him. He's yelling his head off, Doc Spencer said. The small, shrill voice in the distance was growing louder every second, frantic, piercing non-stop. He's having a fit, my father said. It's a good thing we've got a doctor handy. Doc Spencer didn't say anything. That's why she's running, Doctor, my father said. He's having a fit, and she wants to get him in there quick and put him under a cold tap. Some noise, I said. If it isn't a fit, my father said, you can bet your life it's something like that. I doubt it's a fit, the doctor said. My father shifted his feet uneasily on the gravel of the driveway. There's 1,001 different little things to keep happening every day to little babies like that, he said. That's right, isn't it, Doctor? Of course, Doc Spencer said, every day. I knew a baby once who caught his fingers in the spokes of a bramble, my father said. They cut them clean off. The doctor smiled. Whatever it is, my father said, I wish to heavens she'd stop running. It'll give the game away. A long lorry loaded with bricks came up behind the pram, and the driver slowed down and poked his head out of the window to stare. Mrs. Clipstone ignored him and flew on. She was so close now I could see her big red face with the mouth wide open, panting for breath. I noticed she was wearing white gloves on her hands, very prim and dainty, and there was a funny little white hat to match, perched right on top of her head like a mushroom. Suddenly, out of the pram, straight up into the air, flew an enormous pheasant. My father let out a cry of horror. The fool in the lorry began roaring with laughter. The pheasant flapped around drunkenly for a few seconds, then lost height and landed on the grass by the side of the road. Crikey, Doc Spencer said, look at that! A grocer's van came up behind the lorry and began hooting to get by. Mrs. Clipstone kept on running. Then whoosh! A second pheasant flew up out into the pram. Then a third, then a fourth. Great Scott, Doc Spencer said. I knew what's happened. It's the sleeping pills. They're wearing off. My father didn't say a word. Mrs. Clipstone covered the last 50 yards at a tremendous pace. She came swinging to the filling station with birds flying out the pram in all directions. What on earth's happening? She shrieked. She pulled up sharp against the first pump and seized the screaming infant in her arms and dragged him clear. With the weight of the child suddenly lifted away, a great cloud of pheasants rose up out of the gigantic pram. There must have been well over 100 of them, and the whole sky above us was filled with huge brown birds clapping their wings. A sleeping pill doesn't last forever, Doc Spencer said, shaking his head sadly. It always wears off by the next morning. The pheasants were too dopey to fly far. In a few seconds they came again and settled themselves like a swarm of locusts all over the filling station. The place was covered with them. They sat wing to wing, along the roof of the workshop, and about a dozen were clinging to the sill of the office window. Some had flown down onto the rack that had held bottles of lubricating oil, and others were sliding about on the bonnet of Doc Spencer's car. One cockbird with a fine tail was perched superbly on top of a petrol pump, and quite a number, those that were too drunk to do anything else, simply squatted in the driveway at our feet, fluffing their feathers and blinking their small eyes. My father stayed remarkably calm, but not poor Mrs. Clipstone. They nearly pecked him into pieces. She was crying, clasping the screaming baby to her bosom. Take him into the caravan, Mrs. Clipstone, my father said. All these birds are making him nervous. And Danny, push that pram into the workshop, quick. Mrs. Clipstone disappeared into our caravan with the baby. I pushed the pram into the workshop. Across the road, a line of cars had already started forming behind the brick lorry and the grocery van. People were opening their doors and getting out and beginning to cross over to stare at the pheasants. "Watch out, Dad," I said. "Look who's here." Chapter 20. Goodbye, Mr. Hazell. The big shiny silver Rolls Royce had braked suddenly and come to a stop right alongside the filling station behind the wheel. I could see an enormous pink, beery face of Mr. Victor Hazell staring at the pheasants. I could see the mouth hanging open, the eyes bulging out of his head like toadstools, and the skin of his face turning from pink to bright scarlet. The car door opened and out he came, re- resplendent in fawn-coloured riding breeches and high-polished boots. There was a yellow silk scarf with red dots on it round his neck, and he had a sort of bowler hat on his head. The great shooting party was about to begin, and he was on his way to greet the guests. He left the door of the Rolls Royce open and came to us like a charging bull. My father, Doc Spencer, and I stood closer together in the little group, waiting for him. He started shouting at the moment he got out of the car, and he went on shouting for a long time after that. I am sure you would like to know what he said, but I cannot possibly repeat it here. The language he used was so foul and filthy it scorched my ear holes. Words came out of his mouth that I had never heard before, and hoped never to hear again. Little flecks of white foam began forming around his lips and running down his chin on the yellow silk scarf. I glanced at my father. He was standing very still and very calm, waiting for the shouting to finish. The colour was back in his cheeks now, and I could see the tiny twinkling wrinkles of a smile around the corners of his eyes. Dr. Spencer stood beside him, and he was very calm. He was looking at Mr. Hazell rather as one would look at a slug on a leaf of a lettuce in a salad. I myself did not feel quite so calm. "But they are not your pheasants," my father said at last. "They're mine." "Don't lie to me, man," yelled Mr. Hazell. "I'm the only person around here who has pheasants." "They're on my land," my father said quietly. "They flew to my land, and as long as they stay on my land, they belong to me. Don't you know the rules, you bloated old blue-faced baboon?" Doc Spencer started to giggle. Mr. Hazell's skin turned from scarlet to purple. His eyes and his cheeks were bulging so much with rage it looked as though someone was blowing up his face with a pump. He glared at my father. Then he glared at the dopey pheasants swarming all over the filling station. "What's the matter with them?" he shouted. "What have you done to 'em?" At this point, pedalling grandly towards us on his black bicycle, came the arm of the law in the shape of Sergeant Enoch Samways, resplendent in his blue uniform and shining silver buttons. It was always a mystery to me how Sergeant Samways could sniff out trouble wherever it was. Let there be a few boys fighting on the pavement or two motorists arguing over a dented bumper, and you could bet your life the village policeman would be there within minutes. We all now saw him coming now, and a little hush fell upon the entire company. I imagine the same sort of thing happens when a king or a president enters a room full of chattering people. They all stop talking and stand very still as a mark of respect for a powerful and important person. Sergeant Samways dismounted from his bicycle and threaded his way carefully through the mass of pheasants squatting on the ground. The face behind the big black moustache showed no surprise, no anger, no emotion of any kind. It was calm and neutral, as the face of the law should always be. For a full half-minute he allowed his eyes to travel slowly round the filling station, gazing at the mass of pheasants squatting all over the place. The rest of us, including Mr. Hazell, waited in silence for judgment to be pronounced. "Well, well, well," said Sergeant Samways at last, puffing out his chest and addressing nobody in particular. "What may I ask is happening around here?" Sergeant Samways had a funny habit of sometimes putting the letter H in front of words that shouldn't have an H there at all, and as though to balance things out, he would take away the H from the words that should have begun with that letter. "I'll tell you what's happening round here," shouted Mr. Hazell, advancing on the policeman. "These are my pheasants, and this rogue," pointing at my father, "has noted and has enticed them out of my woods onto this filthy little filling station." "Enticed?" said Sergeant Samways, looking first at Mr. Hazell, then at us. "Enticed them, did you say?" "Of course he enticed them." "Well, now," said Sergeant, propping his bicycle carefully against one of our pumps, "this is a very interesting accusation. Very interesting. Indeed, because I ain't ever heard of nobody enticing a pheasant across 6 miles of fields and open countryside. Oh, do you think this enticing was performed, Mr. Hazel, if you may ask? Don't ask me how he did it, because I don't know, shouted Mr. Hazel. But he's done it all right. The proof is all around you. All my finest birds are sitting here in this dirty little filling station when they ought to be up in my own wood getting ready for the shoot. The words poured out of Mr. Hazel's mouth like hot lava from an erupting volcano. Am I correct, says Sergeant Samways? Am I absolutely accurate in thinking that all today is your great shooting party, Mr. Hazel? That's the whole point, cried Mr. Hazel, stabbing his forefinger into the sergeant's chest as though he were punching a typewriter or adding machine. And if I don't get those birds back on my land quick, sharp, some very important people are going to be extremely angry this morning. And one of my guests, I'll have you know, Sergeant, is none other than your own boss, the Chief Constable of the county. So you'd better do something about it fast, haven't you? Unless you want to lose those sergeant stripes of yours. Sergeant Samways did not like people poking their fingers in his chest, least of all Mr. Hazel, and he showed it by twitching up his upper lip so violently that his moustache came alive and jumped about like some small bristly animal. Now, just 1 minute, he said to Mr. Hazel. Just 1 minute, please. Am I to understand that you are accusing this gentleman here of committing this act? Of course I am, cried Mr. Hazel. I know he did it. And do you have any evidence to support this accusation? The evidence is all around you, shouted Mr. Hazel. Are you blind or something? Now my father stepped forward. He took one small pace to the front and fixed Mr. Hazel with his marvellous bright twinkly eyes. Sure you know how these pheasants came here, he said softly. Sure I do know how they came here, snapped Mr. Hazel. Then I shall tell you, my father said, because it is quite simple, really. They all knew they were going to be shot today if they stayed in your wood, so they flew in here to wait until the shooting was over. Rubbish, yelled Mr. Hazel. It's not rubbish at all, my father said. They are extremely intelligent birds, pheasants. Isn't that so, Doctor? They have tremendous brain power, Dr. Spencer said. They know exactly what's going on. It would undoubtedly be a great honour, my father said, to be shot by the Chief Constable of the county, and even greater one to be eaten afterwards by Lord Thistlethwaite, but I do not think a pheasant will see it that way. You are scoundrels, both of you, shouted Mr. Hazel. You're rapscallions of the worst kind. Now then, said Sergeant Samways, insults ain't going to get us nowhere. They only aggravate things. Therefore, gentlemen, I have a suggestion to put before you. I suggest that we all of us make a big effort to drive these birds back over the road onto Mr. Hazel's land. How does that strike you, Mr. Hazel? It'll be a step in the right direction, Mr. Hazel said. Get on with it, then. How about you, William? The sergeant said to my father. Are you agreeable to this action? I think it's a splendid idea, my father said, giving Sergeant Samways one of his funny looks. I'll be very glad to help. So will Danny. So he will up. What's he up to now, I wondered, because whenever my father gave somebody one of his funny looks, it meant something funny was going to happen. And Sergeant Samways, I noticed, also had quite a sparkle in his usually stern eye. Come on, my lads, he cried. Let's push these lazy birds over the road. And with that he began striding around the filling station, waving his arms at the pheasants and shouting, Shoo! Shoo! Off you go! Beat it! Get out of here! My father and I joined him in his rather absurd exercise, and for a second time that morning clouds of pheasants rose up into the air, clapping their enormous wings. It was then I realised that in order to fly across the road, the birds would have to fly over Mr. Hazel's mighty Rolls-Royce, which lay right in their path with its door still open. Most of the pheasants were too dopey to manage this, so down they came again, smack on top of the great silver car. They were all over the roof and the bonnet, sliding and slithering and trying to keep a grip on that beautifully polished surface. I could hear their sharp claws scraping into the paintwork as they struggled to hang on, and already they were depositing their dirty droppings all over the roof. Get them off, screamed Mr. Hazel. Get them away. Don't you worry, Mr. Hazel, sir, Sergeant Samways cried out. We'll fix them for you. Come on, boys. Easy does it. Shoo 'em right over the road. Not on my car, you idiot, Mr. Hazel bellowed, jumping up and down. Send them the other way. We will, sir, we will, answered Sergeant Samways. In less than a minute, The Rolls Royce was literally festooned with pheasants, all scratching and scrabbling and making their disgusting running messes over the shiny silver paint. What is more, I saw at least a dozen of them fly right inside the car through the open door of the driver's seat. Whether or not Sergeant Samways had cunningly steered them in there himself, I didn't know, but it had happened so quickly that Mr. Hazell never even noticed. Get those birds off my car, Mr. Hazell bellowed. Can't you see they're ruining the paintwork? You madman. Paintwork? Sergeant Samways said. What paintwork? He had stopped chasing the pheasants now, and he stood there looking at Mr. Hazell and shaking his head sadly from side to side. We've done our very best to encourage these birds over the road, he said, but they're too ignorant to understand. My car, man, shouted Mr. Hazell. Get them away from my car. Ah, the sergeant said, your car. Yes, I see what you mean, sir. Beastly dirty birds, pheasants are. But why don't you just stop in quick and drive her away fast? They'll have to get off then, won't they? Mr. Hazell, who seemed too glad of an excuse to escape from this madhouse, made a dash for the open door of the Rolls-Royce and leaped into the driver's seat. The moment he was in, Sergeant Samway slammed the door, and suddenly there was the most infernal uproar inside the car as a dozen or more enormous pheasants started squawking and flapping all over the seats and round Mr. Hazell's head. Drive on, Mr. Hazell, sir, shouted Sergeant Samways through the window in his most commanding policeman's voice. Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up! Get going quick! There's no time to lose. Ignore them pheasants, Mr. Hazell, and accelerate that engine. Mr. Hazell didn't have much choice. He had to make a run for it now. He started the engine, and a great roll shot off down the road with clouds of pheasants rising up from it in all directions. Then an extraordinary thing happened. The pheasants that had flown up off the car stayed up in the air. They didn't come flapping drunkenly down as they had expected them to. They stayed up and they kept on flying. Over the top of the filling station they flew, and over the caravan, and over the field, and at the back where our little outdoor lavatory stood, and over the next field, and over the crest of the hill until they disappeared from sight. Great Scott! Dr. Spencer cried. Just look at that! They've recovered. The sleeping pills have worn off at last. Now all the other pheasants around the place are beginning to come awake. They were standing up tall on their legs and ruffling their feathers and turning their heads quickly from side to side. One or two of them started running about, then all the others started running, and when Sergeant Samways flapped his arms at them, the whole lot took off into the air and flew over the filling station and were gone. Suddenly there was not a pheasant left, and it was very interesting to see that none of them had flown across the road or even down the road in the direction of Hazell's Wood and the great shooting party. Every one of them had flown in exactly the opposite direction. Okay, that was a little bit of a longer one today, guys. We are on chapter 21, which will be called Doc Spencer's Surprise, and that will be on page 200, and we are very close to the end. I think the last page on this version that I'm reading is 214, so only really 14 pages to go. But other than that, guys, I'm going to leave it there for the night. Thank you again for listening. Really enjoying doing these read-alongs. I hope you enjoy them too, and they make your life a little bit easier and enjoyable. Again, thank you for listening. Until the next time, guys. Goodbye.